Information space in the 21st century is a domain of national security. It is as important to defend as a nation's land borders, airspace, and shores. And if you are not defending your information space, it's as if you have opened your land borders, allowed the enemy to land on your shores or fly freely through your airspace. There are a number of things China and Russia as well could help.
Hello, 大家好，欢迎回到外媒看中国，我是安博仁。In a major blow to the new multipolar world order, the government of former Syrian President Bashar al-Assad has been overtaken by a terrorist group that until very recently was officially tied to al-Qaeda. So what can China do? Well, former US Marine Brian Berletic says the fall of Assad's government shows a fundamental lack of action from the rest of the world in recognizing information space as the key to national security in the 21st century. And he says that China, with its information ecosystem that is free from US manipulation, needs to do more to help countries in the global south to protect their online and offline media from what he calls poisoning by Washington. Today, Brian is on the show to explain. This is Reports on China. I'm Andy Boreham in Shanghai. Let's get reporting. On today's show, we're not going to focus on the ongoing situation in Syria in any specific detail, largely because of its complexity and constantly changing nature. Instead, we'll focus on just one angle, and that is the very interesting argument that former US Marine political commentator Brian Berletic has made, that information warfare is being completely overlooked in the fight against US hegemony, and that countries like China need to do more to help. Now, I'll just quickly read a part of a tweet Brian posted yesterday where he said, "Not only has the US maintained a large army of terrorists all along Syria's borders, it's maintained significant control over global information space, poisoning entire regions of the planet against their own best interests. While US industry and military power fades, it's maintained its ability to politically interfere and capture entire populations, not through any particular strength, but from a fundamental lack of action from the rest of the world in recognizing information space as the key to national security in the 21st century. Even today, most of the world has surrendered its information space to Silicon Valley and the US State Department. No matter how many tanks you have, if the US can convince your population not to man them or to point their guns in the opposite direction, you still lose." And today, Brian is here to discuss that further. Brian, welcome back to the show. Firstly, I completely agree with your point about the US and its near monopoly on information around the world and how they use information to foment dissent, drum up support, and basically ultimately dictate the direction of sovereign nations. Now, I always say that so-called electoral democracy and media freedom is like a skeleton key that the US basically can use at any time to get what it wants across the globe. Now, you call that tactic the slow poisoning of populations. Can you explain what you mean by that and how it's done?
Yes, absolutely. The United States maintains a massive global media network. It also monopolizes the social media platforms used by nations all around the globe. We do see some exceptions of this. Russia, China, for example, have their own domestically created social media platforms that they get to decide how it's used, what information flows through it, how information is used. In the rest of the world, nations are using US-based social media platforms where the US decides what information is shared, what information is suppressed or promoted. And what this does is allow the United States to shape public opinion and even national identity in these targeted countries. And we know for a fact, because it has been admitted by the Western media itself, that these social media platforms work directly with the US State Department specifically to do this. The 2011 so-called Arab Spring was an example of how the US used social media platforms inside the US to influence the outcome of the political situation in multiple countries at one time. There was a wave of regime change across the region. This is how they got it started. And so a nation that is unable to communicate with its own population, and a population that is being presented a false narrative, offering them a path of less resistance than working hard, sacrificing, and building up their nation, because of human nature, they will always choose the path of less resistance, even if it ultimately leads to self-destruction.
And I was wondering if you can briefly explain what you mean by that, the path of less resistance. Yesterday in your video, you talked about it quite in depth. How would you explain that dynamic?
What the U.S., through its control over information space, does is it offers people a future utopia, Western-style democracy, riches, prosperity, peace, stability. Although we know it leads to none of these things, people believe that they can change their country, change their own life by simply voting the way the United States compels them to vote, or to go out and protest in the way the United States compels them to protest. Ultimately, what they end up doing is destabilizing their country, often destroying it, and plunging their lives into unending tragedy. And ordinary people cannot see this. They work all day. They do not have time to do the in-depth research that analysts have time to do. And because the US controls the flow of information that they are receiving, they do not get to see alternative perspectives on what is happening and why. And even if they do, someone warning them that this promise is not true, often people are going to ignore that. They want to believe that it is. And so the only real best way to prevent this type of poisoning is to remove this disease of propaganda from that nation's information space altogether. This is what Russia and China have done. This is why their societies have not been divided and have now collapsed like they have in so many other countries targeted by this US practice.
Yeah, so China, I mean, as you know, is practically free of US information manipulation owing to things like its Great Firewall and its massive, hugely successful domestic social media space. I always find it quite interesting how so many people in the West tend to believe that just because China doesn't have Twitter and YouTube, that China doesn't have social media altogether. This country has more social media and more choice for locals than anyone in the West by a wide margin, I would argue. This video, for example, will be posted all across Chinese social media, including Bilibili, Douyin, Kuaishou, Toutiao, Weibo, and many more that probably most Westerners have never even heard of. So many in the West, as you know, believe that China's tight control over information is somehow an abuse of human rights, and they can't see that it actually allows China to run its country how it sees fit based on its own circumstances, culture, history, and so on. So in your opinion, what are the benefits of China's protected information space?
Well, to that point about China's protected information space, the collective West also does this exact same thing. They outright censor anyone who is not promoting a narrative conducive to their particular interests. So they are doing the exact same thing. They have a blanket ban on all Russian media. And so the hypocrisy of them pointing to China and saying this is dictatorship, this is an abuse of human rights because they will not allow the US government to poison their population. Well, they are doing the exact same thing. And often they are targeting alternative media who has no connection to Russia or China in the same way media groups the US government is funding through the National Endowment for Democracy are doing in these targeted countries and would do in China if allowed. So that is very important to understand. So China has created from top to bottom its own information space, from the infrastructure to the platforms that are on there where information is shared, to the decisions made about how information flows, as decisions are made in all countries without exception around the globe. And they are able to create an information environment conducive to the best interest of China. And we can see that manifesting in the economic rise of China over the years. It's very important to have this infrastructure from top to bottom in place, because any step in the process that is dependent on a foreign platform, a foreign located platform, or a platform that is able to be influenced by foreign interests, this will create a disruption and an opportunity to threaten that nation's information space.
Yeah, yesterday in your video on YouTube, you mentioned, well, you called on China actually to do more to help countries in the global south to protect their information spaces and kind of neutralize Washington's power to interfere. So which parts of China's system do you think countries like Syria would benefit from, and what can China do to make that happen?
There are a number of things China and Russia as well could help. First of all, there needs to be awareness of this problem that information space in the 21st century is a domain of national security. It is as important to defend as a nation's land borders, airspace, and shores. And if you are not defending your information space, it's as if you have opened your land borders, allowed the enemy to land on your shores or fly freely through your airspace. What China could do is, number one, they have English language media organizations that are getting China's side of the story out there to the international public, to the international audience. Many countries do not have this option, or if they do have an English language media organization, it is heavily influenced by the collective West. Here in Thailand and Southeast Asia, English language media landscape here is outright run by Westerners themselves and Thais who have gone to the West to learn how to do journalism. So everything they say and do reflects Western interests, not Thailand's interests. So this is one thing China could help a nation do: stand up a English language and other languages as well, get their message out to the rest of the world and do it in a way that reflects their best interests, not Washington's. Another problem that I just mentioned is a pipeline to produce journalists that reflect a nation's best interests in the first place. Many times in these other nations, a media organization is going to hire someone with a university background. The universities in that country are targeted and influenced by the US. And if they have gone to the West to study, obviously they have been influenced and essentially captured, indoctrinated by the West and their interests. So there needs to be an indigenous pipeline that produces journalists that reflect that nation's best interests. And third, the creation of social media platforms inside that country that is controlled by the people in that country. The people there decide how information flows, how it is used, what is promoted, what is not allowed, instead of allowing that decision to be made by Silicon Valley and the US State Department. So I think all three of these areas, and then there's many things in between, would make a huge difference in how politics unfolds. And when you really think about it, it is the key to when people use the word democracy. Democracy means self-determination. This allows a nation to access self-determination free of foreign influence. And one other option that I think not just China, but the multipolar world in general should consider is the creation of a worldwide social media platform. Nations within the multipolar world can use to share information with one another. Right now, if I want to get my message out to people across the multipolar world, I am entirely dependent on US-based social media platforms. So the creation of social media platforms within a nation and between nations, I think this should be a high priority of the multipolar world in the 21st century, recognizing information space as a national security domain.
Very important suggestions. Hey, last question for you today, Brian. Now, we all know how the US has tried to frame the dominant struggle against US hegemony and aggression as freedom versus authoritarianism, where they obviously posit themselves as the morally righteous and good side of the coin, if you will. How would you frame the push for a more multipolar world?
It really is a struggle for national sovereignty, the primacy of national sovereignty above all other things. The United States wants to impose a global order on all nations. The multipolar world want all nations to work in a position of mutual respect and respecting national sovereignty first and foremost, non-interference, constructive cooperation, even competition, but not conflict. The United States talks about freedom. It talks about democracy. It talks about revolution in countries that it's targeting, governments that it does not like. And then when we look into the details, these freedom fighters are literally listed on the US State Department's website as designated foreign terrorist organization. So it is an act that is worn very thin. I think many people are seeing through it, and everyone needs to continue working to continue in that direction.
Brian Berletic, thank you so much for coming on the show today. And on that note, that will be it for today, you guys. But as always, I'd love to hear what you have to say. Should China do more to help protect other countries in this information war? And how do you think that could best be achieved? Do let me know down below. And don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you haven't already. It really does help the channel. I'll see you all next time. Bye-bye.